Whoa! Not a hope for Matthew Wade. It's not Matthew Wade.
Hello and welcome to episode 36 of Radio Cricket. That's 36, the same number of times that Gautam Gambhir has blamed his poor form on the Egyptian sun god Ra. Speaking to you live from Czech Republic, I am Steve Smith. No, wait, I can actually bowl leg spin and actually have a purpose in life. I'm Nishant Joshi, and I'm joined by the man whose voice has made many a fair lady swoon. It is James Marsh.
Well, thank you, Nishant. I think I make about as many women swoon as Steve Smith does, but thanks for your kind words anyway. How's your week been?
Yeah, I've been doing great, James, thanks. And I'd like to thank everyone of our listeners who tuned into our 2012 review. I'm glad so many of you took time to also share our podcast. We really appreciate it. And the thing is, James, I was checking the stats of where our listeners are coming from all around the world, and I found that we're listened to in some pretty remote areas of the globe. Places such as Indonesia, Sweden, Oman. And I was most impressed by our listener in Mongolia. So I'd like to ask you, if you are our solitary listener in Mongolia, thank you very much, and please do get in touch. We'd love to hear how you ended up there. Are you an exiled cricketer running away from the crimes you may have committed against cricket? And if so, do you have any space for Nick Knight?
And now to the land down under, and Nishant, can you hear the thunder of Mickey Arthur getting rather pissed off with critics of Australia's selection policy? I personally think that Australia have been rotating their injuries very successfully in recent weeks, but nevertheless, Arthur has labelled those that have questioned this somewhat revolving door policy as either naive or stubborn. Now, I wouldn't for a minute ever accuse you of either of those two things, Nishant, but I don't think you see eye to eye with the Australian coach on this issue.
No, I think it's a very, very odd policy that Mickey Arthur and John Inverarity have got going at the moment. One thing they did do was hit back at the critics by dismissing all of their points surrounding the rotation policy. And the thing I couldn't get my head around is that it seemed like the Australian selection panel actually wants to hide the Australian fast bowlers' injuries. For example, they rested Mitchell Starc quite infamously now for the Boxing Day test because of an ankle impingement, something which we've only just found out about a couple of days ago. And the thing that we're all thinking right now is that why didn't they just tell us about it before the Boxing Day test itself? The reason that John Inverarity gave for this is that he didn't want the players themselves to come under pressure. So it kind of gives a sort of Shane Watson, Cinderella sort of mentality where all of them are playing with glass ankles and ceramic elbows where any sort of chink can put them off the park for months at a time. So really, I'm not in agreement with the Australian selectors on that point at all. And the thing is that right now I've got a bit of a bone to pick with Mickey Arthur, because in the past few days he's contradicted himself a bit, and he said that he knows what his best team is, and that Australia always play to win. And specifically he said that every time we pick a team, we're giving guys opportunities and picking what we think is the best side possible to go out and do the job and win. But at the same time, for example, Mickey Arthur has come up with a bit of an interesting policy, which I completely disagree with, of giving players one game each before essentially abandoning them like a prom night baby on the side of the street. In particular, he gave Usman Khawaja the first game of the ODI series against Sri Lanka, and in that game, Usman Khawaja was actually run out pretty early on in his innings, and then he was dumped for the second ODI, replaced by none other than the world's second greatest all-rounder, Steve Smith. So it seems a bit pointless. I mean, Steve Smith's already played 33 ODIs, and you just kind of wonder what the value is in Steve Smith playing just a single ODI, essentially without much context in the series. And it's just the perfect opportunity this series to actually give someone like Khawaja a long run in the side. However, I wouldn't actually have Khawaja in the side at all, even though I feel that he's been really harshly treated at the moment. I'd have someone like Ben Rohrer in the side, who's done exceptionally well in the Big Bash. I think that he's a kind of silent MVP at the moment. He won the Champions League T20 with the Sydney Sixers, and now he's going all guns blazing for the Melbourne Renegades in the Big Bash League as well. I do think that he's a kind of hussy type of character. We did mention his name quite a few months ago, and people kind of scoffed at the thought of Ben Rohrer playing for the national side, but he's 31 years old, and I do think there's more than a bit of Mike Hussey about him, or perhaps more of a Michael Bevan. He's very much a nudger and nerdler. He does know how to pace an innings, and he really does seem to have the sort of nous that Australia kind of need at the moment.
Well, sure, Nishan. Well, I hope that bone you were picking comes from a KFC family bucket, or Mark Nicholas will be most disappointed with you. In the defence of Cricket Australia, I mean, I suppose as a cricket board they do have a bit of history in terms of this sort of adherence, some might say addiction to sports science. As far back as sort of the 80s, they were conducting studies into bowler workloads and so on and so forth. There's actually an Australian Cricket Board, the forerunner of Cricket Australia, study from 2000, which talks about the importance of rest between practice as much as rest between games, which seems to be a notion which has become almost entirely alien. I don't see why that side of a bowler's workload can't be reduced as well. There's also a recent study from the University of South Australia, which actually looked at the type of shoes which bowlers wore, and they actually found that the specialist cricket shoes which fast bowlers wear were actually more likely to induce injuries and more likely to cause strain on parts of the body such as the knee than actual normal trainers. And now, by popular demand, our listeners' questions section is back. So, Nishan, I've managed to filter out the perfume-stained ones asking what you're wearing. So, I'm just going to move on to one from Not Mitch Johnson. And he inquires, should teams have separate squads for different formats?
Well, James, firstly, to answer your first question, I would say it's red, lacy, and not for public consumption. To answer Not Mick Johnson's question, thanks for tweeting in your question. It's something that the South African and English teams have pretty much led the way in, having already appointed different coaches for different formats, and I certainly think that that's the future. The key buzzword right now is workload management, and that's all the South African, English, and now Australian teams have been saying for the past year or two. And Australia seem to be taking this policy to a bit of an extreme, trying to give every available player a baggy green. Just about every single player in state cricket right now stands a chance of being selected for the next Australian ODI or Test match. But as it stands, teams just don't have the depth of players to have totally different squads for each format, although you can see the long-term benefits in keeping workloads to a minimum. At the same time, it's a bit of a redundant hypothetical, because as we all know, Tests will become extinct in the next 30 years, and the only cricket we'll be watching will be the Mozambique Premier League. And now a tweet in from Jack Mendel, who asks us, what was the best spell and Test innings of 2012? There were plenty to choose from, James.
Well, indeed, in terms of best spells, I think certainly the most devastating one was Abdul Rahman's back in early 2012 against England in the second test in Abu Dhabi, when England were set a target of just 145 to win the second test and level the series. It really was a formidable display, although England did play him like a drunk trying to get his key in the door after a particularly heavy night out. So, I don't know, in terms of devastating spells, I would say that one, although things did then rather go up in smoke for poor Rahman after that. Nishan, what about you?
Well, my best Test innings of 2012 has to go to Faf du Plessis, and it was on his Test debut in Adelaide after making 78 in his first innings. In the second innings, du Plessis came in at 45 for 4, with South Africa needing to bat out the best part of 2 days. And the thing is, nobody actually realised that du Plessis had this sort of resolve in him. We all sort of pigeonhole. Well, I say we, but to be honest, I think it was more the other half of this podcast who thought that Faf du Plessis maybe didn't have the brass balls required to carry out such feats at Test level. But as it turned out, du Plessis ended up batting 127 overs, which is pretty remarkable, coming at number 6 on your Test debut. In a year of daddy hundreds and doubles and triples from Amla and Michael Clarke, I think that Faf du Plessis really does deserve all the praise that comes his way. And interesting stat about Faf du Plessis, after 4 Tests for South Africa, he scored the second most number of runs in history, only second to Barry Richards.
And now we've got a question from Borna Chatura, who's more dedicated to radio cricket than Viru is to Jelebi. And Nishan, she asks, I'm still 23. Do you think my grandson has the slightest chance of seeing Sachin play?
Well, Purna, thank you very much for tweeting in your question. I do have high hopes that Sachin will do an Afridi and unretire, perhaps when Ravi Jadeja is inevitably appointed as Indian captain. I do hope that there will be a national sort of uprising and that Sachin will be the leader against what will effectively be the cricketing version of a zombie apocalypse. But James, I do believe that you have something to say about Sachin's son and what he's been up to in the past week.
Well, I do. Well, there's been a bit of a backlash against poor old Arjun Tendulkar. I mean, he's been selected to play for Mumbai under-14s, and, you know, I do feel a little bit sorry for him because there's been accusations of nepotism, but it seems grossly unfair because, I mean, at least his dad had to wait until his late 30s until people started suggesting he should retire. Poor old Arjun is having his place questioned before he even starts shaving. And now a question from the Nugget, who's tweeted in to ask, who are your 2 finalists for the Champions Trophy in 2013?
Thanks for tweeting in. This year's Champions Trophy will be held in England in the middle of summer, and I do use summer in the loosest term possible. And it is early doors, a few months still away, but I think that the West Indies proved themselves last year as a serious limited overside in the World T20. They've got an excellent blend of dynamic batsmen and some of the best bowlers in the world as well. You've got the likes of Chris Gale, Marlon Samuels reaching peak form as well, and they're mixing it with the likes of Fidel Edwards and Kemar Roach. So they are, at the very least, an incredibly exciting team to watch. You just wonder whether they can transfer their form from 20 overs into 50 overs. And to be honest, all they need to do for that is increase their attention span by a couple of hours every day. And I also like the direction that Pakistan are going in right now, which is very much up, with the debut of Mohammad Irfan very recently. They seem to be more organised at the moment, with more defined roles for each player, whereas before with Pakistan it was just 11 people turning up and playing for themselves and maybe even sometimes their wallets.
Well, that's scurrilous, Nishan. Pakistan play for Captain Misbah, as you well know. But indeed, I've been also very impressed as well, but I might also break a habit of a lifetime and actually tip my own country, England, to make it through. So I think I'd go for the West Indies in England. And now a question from Jigar Mehta, and he's tweeted in to ask, have you ever imagined Piyush Chawla and Samit Patel one-on-one in a burger eating competition? If yes, who was the fastest to 50?
Well, thank you very much for your very creative question. I have to say, even though I like to think that I do have quite the imagination, even when I've had cheese before bed, I've never dreamt up such a nightmarish scenario. I'd say that in the pie chucking contest that they had in the World T20, I'd say that Piyush Chawla won hands down. But in a burger eating competition, I'd say that Samit Patel just has that stamina, that lust for greasiness. And perhaps Piyush Chawla just prefers to get his kicks somewhere else. I'd see him more as a sort of paneer samosa type of man.
I have also never imagined such a horrific scenario, and in fact, I would rather watch Mark Cosgrove model a crotchless mankini than ever have to witness such a thing.
And our final question comes in from Prague Cricket, who's been a long-time listener of our podcast, and he asks, Dear Mr. Alt Cricket, oh please, Mr. is so formal, James prefers Your Excellency. He asks, in light of New Zealand's heroic batting efforts, I've revisited one of my favourite sports, irritating Kiwis. And this leads me to a wider point. What would Messrs. Joshi and Marsh do if they were in charge of the ICC Futures Tour programme? He goes on to say, we can't trust the ICC with this, we can't trust the BCCI with this, but we can trust radio cricket to find the right path.
Well, that's very touching faith in us, Nishan. I think the first thing I'd do if I was put in charge of the FTP was order a job lot of Valium, because to me it's probably a more thankless task than washing Jade Dernbach's jockstraps. Although having said that, it is a subject which is very much on vogue at the moment, and in particular with regard to this idea of having a 2-tier test system. There have been a few people talking about this recently, not least George Dobell, the chief correspondent of ESPN Cricinfo, and I've actually read up on it a little bit. I've seen various proposals for how this might work. Some people have even been suggesting that there should be a 3-tier or even a 4-tier system. But I must admit, I've had a look at these, and although I've ended up feeling a little bit like Ian Healy has been reading me an explanation of quantum physics, I'm pretty sure that a lot of them do have some merit. I don't think this is the first time this has bubbled up, and I think very much like the form of cricket teams, this is quite a sort of cyclical debate. But for me, I suppose there's a few questions which would have to be asked, not least, when would the cut-off point be for the present system, i.e. when would we start with this sort of 2-tier or 3-tier system? Because, of course, I can't imagine if this was being suggested in the mid-90s that England would have readily agreed to this. In the same way, it would be a very, very brave administrator within the BCCI that would perhaps agree to sign India up at the moment, given the trajectory that their form is on. I'm not saying they're going to continue on that trajectory. Yeah, I suppose the other thing is cash issues. Which board are going to commit themselves to playing home and away series against 2 or even 3 of Bangladesh, New Zealand, Kiwi fans, and Zimbabwe, home and away in the space of a couple of years if they've got a new TV deal to negotiate on the horizon. Of course, we've already seen in this South Africa versus New Zealand series, South Africa chop off a test against New Zealand, the prestigious Boxing Day one no less, and replace it with some money spinning or attempted money spinning T20 internationals. The other factor that I might possibly raise is, in the words of former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, you've got to think about events, dear boy, and specifically with the politics of cricket. So, of course, obviously recently we've had things like India refusing to play Pakistan after the Mumbai bombings. Of course, England still at the moment won't play Zimbabwe because of political reasons. Zimbabwe themselves have voluntarily suspended themselves, perhaps quite rightly, from Test cricket.
They're such darlings, aren't they, James?
Well, perhaps Bob is just a little bit misunderstood, Nishant. There's been some good articles on this from people like Tim Wigmore, who writes for Cricinfo, and also someone like Michael, the cricket geek. But Nishant, what about yourself?
Well, for me, James, the interesting part about this whole test debate is that it seems to be boiling down to the fact that we're trying to accommodate tests into the schedule, whereas, say, 10, 20 years ago, we weren't just tolerating tests and keeping them sort of alive like the grandparents at the old folks' home. We were kind of actually embracing them fully. And the thing for me about a 2-tier system is that it wouldn't work simply because the second tier wouldn't generate the same amount of cash, and this would mean that the players can't actually play professionally and would almost certainly opt to play in the domestic T20 leagues rather than in the test. We've already seen it with the likes of Gale, Peterson and several other players, and when they're faced with the prospect of earning $500,000 with Mumbai or perhaps $5,000 with Bangladesh, you can see the road that we're going down with Test versus T20. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much for your questions and thank you very much for listening. Of course, if you do have any questions at all that you'd like myself, or rather James, to answer in his sultry, sexy voice, which seems to attract all of the female listeners of our podcast, don't they, James?
Oh, yes.
Then please. Okay, that was slightly Jimmy Savile sort of creepy sort of term, but we'll go with it. So if you do have any questions, then please do tweet us in at altcricket, or do drop us in an email, home@alternativecricket.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Do check us out on soundcloud.com/Radio Cricket, and do comment along as you listen. Thanks for tuning in. I've been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh.
Goodbye.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.